Imagine standing at the edge of the sea in the middle of the night. The wind is howling. The waves crash violently against the shore. Behind you, an army is coming. Thousands of soldiers. Chariots racing across the desert. The thunder of hooves shaking the ground. In front of you, there is only water. Nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. This was the terrifying moment faced by the people of Israel thousands of years ago. For generations they had lived as slaves in Egypt, forced to work under the rule of the powerful Pharaoh. But everything changed when God chose one man to lead them to freedom. That man was Moses. Through miracles and signs, Moses confronted Pharaoh and demanded that the Israelites be set free. After devastating plagues struck the land of Egypt, Pharaoh finally let them go. Hundreds of thousands of people began their journey out of slavery. For the first time in generations, they were free. But their freedom did not last long. Pharaoh soon realized that he had lost the labor force that built his empire. Furious and determined, he ordered his entire army to pursue the escaping Israelites. Chariots rolled across the desert. Warriors prepared their weapons. The most powerful military force of the ancient world was coming. Soon the Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the vast waters of the Red Sea. Fear spread through the camp. People cried out. Some began to panic. Had they escaped Egypt only to die here? But in the middle of that impossible situation, Moses stood before the sea. What happened next would become one of the most powerful miracles ever recorded in the Bible. A moment when the sea itself obeyed the command of God, and the path to freedom appeared where no path had ever existed before. But how did the Israelites end up trapped at the edge of the sea? To understand that moment, we must go back to the beginning of their escape from Egypt. For generations, the people of Israel lived as slaves in the land of Egypt. Their lives were filled with endless labor. Day after day, they worked under the command of the powerful ruler of Egypt, Pharaoh. They built cities, carried heavy stones, and served an empire that did not show them mercy. Their cries rose into the heavens, and God heard them. God chose a man named Moses to lead his people out of slavery. Moses had once lived in the palace of Pharaoh himself. But after many years away, he returned to Egypt with a mission that seemed impossible, to demand the freedom of an entire nation. When Moses first stood before Pharaoh, the king laughed at him. "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" Pharaoh asked. Instead of releasing the Israelites, Pharaoh made their lives even harder. The slaves were forced to work longer hours. Their suffering increased. But Moses was not alone. God began to reveal his power through a series of terrifying signs that struck the land of Egypt. The Nile River turned to blood. Frogs filled the streets and houses. Gnats and flies covered the land. Livestock died. Boils broke out on people and animals. Thunderstorms of hail destroyed crops. Locusts devoured what remained. Darkness covered the entire land for days. Each plague was a warning. Each plague was a chance for Pharaoh to change his heart. But Pharaoh refused. Again and again, he hardened his heart and refused to let the Israelites go. Finally, the night came when the final plague would fall upon Egypt. Before it happened, God gave the Israelites very specific instructions. Each family was told to sacrifice a lamb and place its blood on the doorposts of their homes. That night they were to remain inside and prepare to leave quickly. They were to eat their meal fully dressed, with sandals on their feet and staffs in their hands. It was a night of preparation, a night of waiting, and a night that would change history forever. As darkness fell across Egypt, silence filled the land. Then, during the middle of the night, the final plague struck. Every firstborn in Egypt died, from the son of Pharaoh in the palace to the firstborn of prisoners and livestock. A cry of grief rose from every corner of the nation. No house was untouched. Pharaoh, broken and terrified, finally called for Moses and Aaron. "Leave," he commanded. "Take your people and go. Worship your God as you asked." At last, after generations of slavery, the Israelites were free. The news spread quickly through the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. Families gathered their belongings. Mothers carried children. Fathers led livestock in carts. What began as a small group quickly became an enormous moving nation. The Bible records that around 600,000 men left Egypt, not counting women and children. The number of people traveling together may have reached over 2 million. It was one of the largest migrations in ancient history, and they were not leaving quietly. The Egyptians, terrified by the plagues, urged them to leave as quickly as possible. Many Egyptians even gave the Israelites silver, gold, and clothing. What had once been a nation of slaves now left Egypt with great wealth. During the day, a mysterious pillar of cloud appeared before the people, guiding them through the desert. At night, the cloud became a pillar of fire, lighting their path in the darkness. It was a visible sign that God Himself was leading them. Imagine the sight. An endless line of people stretching across the desert. Children laughing in disbelief that they were finally free. Elderly men and women walking slowly but determined. Livestock, carts, and supplies moving across the sand. And ahead of them, the glowing pillar of fire lighting the night sky. Freedom felt real. But far behind them, something dangerous was happening. Back in Egypt, Pharaoh began to think about what had just occurred. The slaves who had built his cities were gone. The labor force that sustained his empire had vanished overnight. His pride began to burn with anger. How could we let them go? He asked his officials. Pharaoh quickly changed his mind. He ordered his army to prepare for pursuit. 600 of Egypt's finest chariots were gathered, along with countless soldiers and officers. The most powerful military force in the region began racing across the desert. Their goal was simple: bring the Israelites back. As the Israelites continued their journey, they eventually reached a place near the waters of the Red Sea. The sea stretched endlessly before them. At first, the people likely believed they would soon travel around it. But something strange happened. Instead of leading them away from the sea, God instructed Moses to guide the people to camp right beside it. Mountains surrounded them on both sides. The sea stood before them. It was a beautiful place, but it was also a trap. Meanwhile, Pharaoh's army continued moving quickly through the desert. Chariot wheels rolled across the sand. Dust clouds rose behind the marching soldiers. Soon, scouts in the Israelite camp saw something terrifying in the distance. A massive army approaching. The sun reflected off hundreds of chariots. Weapons glittered in the light. The Egyptians were coming. Fear spread instantly through the camp. The Israelites had no weapons. They had no army. They were families, travelers, and former slaves. Behind them was the most powerful army in the world. In front of them was the sea. Panic erupted among the people. Some cried out in terror. Others ran through the camp shouting warnings. Soon, many began blaming Moses. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die in the wilderness? They shouted. We told you to leave us alone. It would have been better to serve the Egyptians than to die here. The hope of freedom suddenly felt like a deadly mistake. But Moses stood calmly before the people. He looked at the terrified crowd and spoke words that would echo through history. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. Those words must have sounded impossible, because at that moment, the thunder of Pharaoh's army was already approaching. Chariots were getting closer. Soldiers were preparing for battle, and the sea still blocked the path ahead. The stage was set for a moment that would become one of the most famous miracles in the entire Bible. But what would Moses do next? Could a nation of former slaves escape an army with nowhere to run? And could the sea itself become their path to freedom? The answer was about to unfold in a way no one could have imagined. Night was beginning to fall across the desert. The air grew colder as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The vast camp of the Israelites stretched across the sand beside the waters of the Red Sea. Thousands of fires flickered in the darkness. Families gathered close together. Mothers held their children tightly. The elders spoke quietly among themselves. But no one could ignore what was happening in the distance. A cloud of dust was rising on the horizon. At first it looked small, but slowly it grew larger. Soon the distant rumble of wheels began to echo through the desert. The scouts ran through the camp, shouting the warning. The Egyptians are coming. Panic spread instantly. Men climbed hills and rocks to look across the desert. What they saw filled them with terror. An army was approaching. Hundreds of chariots raced forward in formation. Soldiers marched behind them with shields and spears. Torches lit the darkening horizon. This was the army of Pharaoh, the most powerful military force in the ancient world. The Israelites had escaped Egypt only days before, but now the army that once controlled their lives had come to bring them back. Or worse, the sound of chariot wheels thundered closer. The ground began to tremble beneath their feet. Fear erupted throughout the camp. Some people fell to their knees in despair. Others cried out in anger. They rushed toward Moses, surrounding him with accusations. "Why did you bring us here?" they shouted. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt? We told you to leave us alone. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Their voices echoed through the night. For generations they had lived as slaves. Fear was all they had ever known. Now that fear had returned, behind them was an army that had the power to destroy them. Before them stretched the endless waters of the Red Sea. The waves crashed violently against the shore. There was nowhere to go, no path through the mountains, no boats waiting to carry them away. They were trapped. The chariots continued to approach. Torchlight flickered in the distance as the Egyptian army moved closer and closer. The soldiers of Pharaoh were confident. They believed the escape of the Israelites was over. From their perspective, victory was already certain. The sea blocked the path ahead. The mountains trapped the people on both sides. All the Egyptians needed to do was march forward. Soon they would capture the Israelites and return them to Egypt as slaves once again. But while fear consumed the people, Moses stood silently before the sea. The wind moved across the water. Waves crashed against the shore. The dark sky stretched endlessly above him. In that moment, Moses turned away from the people and cried out to God. The situation seemed impossible. But God responded with an answer that would change everything. "Why are you crying out to me?" God said. "Tell the Israelites to move forward." Then God gave Moses a command that must have sounded unbelievable. "Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide the water." The promise was astonishing. The sea itself would open. A path would appear where no path had ever existed. Meanwhile, the Egyptian army was now very close. The thunder of hooves and wheels echoed across the desert. Torches lit the darkness as soldiers prepared to attack. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. The mysterious pillar of cloud that had been guiding the Israelites moved. This pillar, the visible presence of God that had led them since leaving Egypt, suddenly shifted its position. Instead of remaining in front of the people, it moved behind them. The cloud now stood between the Israelites and the approaching Egyptian army. On the side facing the Egyptians, the cloud became dark and terrifying. They could see nothing beyond it. But on the side facing the Israelites, the cloud glowed with light, illuminating the entire camp. It created a barrier, a wall of darkness for the Egyptians, a wall of protection for the Israelites. All night long the two sides remained separated. The Egyptian army waited impatiently. They knew their prey was close, but they could not see them. Meanwhile, Moses walked slowly toward the edge of the sea. The wind had begun to rise. Stronger and stronger gusts swept across the water. The waves crashed violently against the shore. People watched from the camp in confusion. Some wondered what Moses was doing. Others whispered quietly among themselves. Then Moses lifted his staff. He stretched his hand out over the waters of the Red Sea. And something incredible began to happen. A powerful wind blew across the sea. Not for a moment, not for a few minutes, but for hours. The wind roared through the night like a storm from heaven itself. The waters of the sea began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. The waves pulled away from the shore. The water began separating, rising on both sides. The sea itself was opening. What had once been deep water was now revealing the ground beneath it. Mud dried quickly under the force of the wind. A path began to form, a road through the middle of the sea. On each side of that path, towering walls of water stood like enormous moving mountains. The people stared in disbelief. No one had ever seen anything like it. The sea was parting, and the path before them was growing wider and clearer. The impossible was becoming reality. The path to freedom was opening before their eyes. But the night was far from over. Soon the Israelites would have to make a choice. Would they trust what they were seeing? Would they step forward into the path that had opened through the sea? And what would happen when Pharaoh's army finally saw what had occurred? The most dramatic moment of the story was about to begin. The wind did not stop. All night long it roared across the waters of the Red Sea, pushing the waves farther and farther apart. What had once been a deep and endless body of water was now transforming into something no human had ever witnessed before. A path was forming. The waters were rising on both sides like enormous walls, towering high above the ground below. Between those walls of water, the seabed slowly appeared. At first it was wet and muddy, but the powerful wind continued to blow, drying the ground and clearing a passage. By the time the night had grown deep, The impossible had happened. There was now a road through the middle of the sea. People in the Israelite camp stared in complete disbelief. Fathers lifted their children so they could see. Mothers whispered in amazement. Elders who had lived long lives shook their heads in wonder. None of them had ever seen anything like it. At the front of the camp stood Moses, his staff still raised toward the sea. The wind rushed past him, pulling the waters back and holding them apart. Behind the Israelites, the mysterious pillar of cloud still blocked the path of the Egyptian army. The soldiers of Pharaoh waited impatiently in the darkness, unable to see what was happening beyond the wall of cloud. But the Israelites could see everything. The sea had opened. The path to freedom was now directly in front of them. Then Moses spoke to the people. "Move forward." Those words carried across the camp. For a moment, no one moved. The sight before them was breathtaking, but also terrifying. A path through the sea, walls of water towering on both sides. It looked impossible. What if the water suddenly rushed back? What if the ground collapsed beneath their feet? But slowly, one group stepped forward. Then another. Families gathered their belongings. Parents held the hands of their children. The first people began walking onto the path that stretched into the sea. The ground beneath their feet was firm. The wind continued to blow powerfully above them, holding the water back. Soon thousands of people were moving forward. The Israelites began crossing the sea. Imagine the scene. A massive nation of people walking through the center of the sea itself. On both sides, towering walls of water shimmered under the moonlight. The waves stood frozen like giant transparent mountains. Fish could be seen swimming behind the walls of water. The roar of the wind filled the night air. Torches and lanterns lit the long path as the people moved forward. Children stared wide-eyed at the water beside them. Some pointed in amazement. Others held tightly to their parents, unsure whether to be excited or afraid. Elders walked slowly, leaning on staffs, tears in their eyes as they realized what was happening. For generations they had lived as slaves. Now they were walking through the sea itself toward freedom. Hour after hour the people continued moving forward. The crossing took time. There were many people. Families, animals, carts, and supplies stretched across the path. But the sea remained open. The wind never stopped. The walls of water never collapsed. God was holding the sea apart so his people could pass through safely. Eventually, as the night began to grow lighter, the final groups of Israelites stepped onto the path. The entire nation was now moving across the seabed. Meanwhile, behind the pillar of cloud, the Egyptian army was growing impatient. The soldiers of Pharaoh could not see the Israelites, but they knew they were close. Their chariots waited, horses stomping the sand. Warriors gripped their weapons tightly. They were eager for battle. Then, just before dawn, the pillar of cloud moved again. The barrier between the two groups suddenly lifted. The Egyptian soldiers could finally see what had happened, and what they saw must have stunned them. The sea had opened. A massive path stretched through the water, and the Israelites were already crossing it. The soldiers shouted in excitement. From their perspective, the situation was perfect. The Israelites had nowhere to escape. They were trapped inside the sea itself. If the Egyptian army chased them into that path, they could easily capture them before they reached the other side. Pharaoh quickly gave the command. Forward! The chariots surged ahead. Horses raced toward the opening in the sea. Hundreds of chariots entered the path, followed by thousands of soldiers. They pursued the Israelites directly into the sea. Dust and sand rose behind them as the army charged forward. The soldiers were confident. They believed victory was certain. But something strange soon began to happen. The ground beneath the chariot wheels became unstable. What had been firm ground for the Israelites now began to shift. Wheels struggled to move through the seabed. Chariots slowed. Some wheels sank into the sand. Others became stuck. The horses grew nervous. Soldiers began shouting in confusion. The army that had entered the sea so confidently was suddenly losing control. And as the Egyptian soldiers struggled to move forward, they began to realize something terrifying. They were not chasing the Israelites into a trap. They had walked directly into a miracle. And the God who opened the sea for his people was now about to close it. The most dramatic moment of the entire story was about to unfold. Dawn had not yet broken. The eastern sky was still dark blue, slowly fading into pale silver. A cold wind swept across the desert as the people of Israel stood on the far side of the sea, breathing hard, hearts pounding, still trying to understand what had just happened. Behind them stretched the path they had walked, a path that should not exist. Moments earlier, that ground had been the bottom of the sea. Now it was beginning to tremble. Far out between the towering walls of water, the Egyptian army thundered forward. Thousands of chariots raced into the passage, wheels cutting into the damp sand, horses screaming, soldiers shouting. Pharaoh had made his decision. He would not let them go. Forward, the commanders yelled. The army surged deeper between the walls of water, convinced victory was moments away. But something strange began to happen. The ground beneath the chariot wheels started to shift. Wet sand clung to the rims. Horses stumbled. Wheels sank deeper with every turn. Soldiers looked down in confusion. What is happening? A wheel cracked. Another chariot tipped sideways. Panic rippled through the ranks. Then the wind changed. All night long, a powerful east wind had held the sea back like invisible hands. But now the wind began to weaken. Slowly, almost gently. At the far shore, the Israelites watched in silence. Some began to realize what was coming. Moses stood at the edge of the sea, staff still in his hand. The pillar of fire that had protected them through the night began to lift. The path through the sea started to narrow. Inside the passage, Egyptian soldiers finally understood. Fear flooded their faces. Retreat, someone shouted. Turn back. But it was too late. The water walls that had stood like mountains began to shake. Then they moved. At first only a ripple, then a roar. The sea collapsed. Waves crashed down with terrifying force, swallowing chariots, horses, and soldiers in a single unstoppable surge. The thunder of water filled the sky as the Red Sea returned to its place. Moments later, it was quiet. Where the Egyptian army had stood moments before, only waves rolled across the surface of the sea. The most powerful army in the world had disappeared, not by the sword, not by rebellion, but by the power of God. On the shore, the people of Israel stood frozen. No one spoke. They looked at the sea, then at Moses, then at the empty horizon where their enemies had once stood. For the first time in generations, they were free. No chains, no masters, no whips. Just the open wilderness ahead of them and the promise God had made to their ancestors long ago. A woman suddenly began to cry, not from fear, from relief. Then someone laughed. Then another shouted in joy. Within moments, the entire camp erupted. People fell to their knees in the sand, lifting their hands toward heaven. Children ran along the shore. Men embraced each other. Women sang songs of freedom. Miriam, the sister of Moses, lifted a tambourine and began to sing. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider. He is thrown into the sea. The people answered her song. Voices rose across the desert like thunder. For the first time in their lives, they understood something they would never forget. God had not only brought them out of Egypt, he had destroyed the power that enslaved them. The sea behind them was now a boundary. Egypt could not follow. Slavery could not return. Their past had been buried beneath the waves. Ahead of them lay a journey they could not yet imagine. A desert, a mountain, a covenant, and a nation that would one day change the world. But for now, as the first rays of sunlight touched the water of the Red Sea, the people stood on the shore and watched the waves roll quietly again. As if the sea itself whispered a message to every generation that would hear this story. When God makes a way, even the ocean must move. And when he closes the sea behind you, your enemies cannot follow. Waterwave sparkles. Freedom felt powerful the first day. The people of Israel walked through the desert with songs still echoing in their hearts. Just hours earlier, they had watched the sea collapse over the army of Egypt. The impossible had happened before their eyes. God had split the sea. God had saved them. God had defeated Pharaoh. For the first time in their lives, they were not slaves. They were a free people. And yet, freedom came with a journey. The desert stretched endlessly before them, mile after mile of dry land, rocky hills, and burning sun. At first, no one complained. The miracle of the sea was still fresh in their minds. Children ran along the path. Families walked together. Some even laughed as they imagined the future ahead. But the desert has a way of testing faith. 3 days passed, then 4, then 5. The water they had carried from Egypt began to run out. Lips became dry. Feet grew tired. The sun felt heavier every hour. Finally, someone shouted from the front of the camp. Water! The cry spread quickly through the thousands of people. Water! Water! Hope rushed through the crowd as they hurried toward the place where water shimmered under the sunlight. People ran ahead, dropping their bags, kneeling beside the pool. But the moment the first man tasted it, his face twisted. He spit it out instantly. It's bitter. The water could not be drunk. The place was called Mara, which means bitter. Suddenly, the mood changed. The people who had been singing days earlier began to murmur, then complain, then accuse. They turned toward Moses. What are we supposed to drink? Why did you bring us here? Did you bring us into the desert just to die? Their voices rose louder with every complaint. It was strange. Only days earlier they had seen the sea split open. They had watched an army disappear beneath the waves. But now, standing before bitter water, fear returned. This is how the desert works. It reveals what lives inside the human heart. Moses did not argue with them. Instead, he turned away from the crowd and cried out to God. Lord, what should I do? God answered, not with thunder, not with lightning, but with something simple. God showed Moses a piece of wood. Throw it into the water. Moses obeyed. He picked up the wood and dropped it into the bitter pool. The moment it touched the water, something changed. The bitterness disappeared. The water became sweet, clean, drinkable. The people rushed forward in amazement, kneeling to drink. Children filled their cups. Families shared water with relief. Once again, God had provided. But this moment carried a deeper lesson. Through Moses, God spoke to the people. If you listen carefully to the Lord your God, and do what is right in his eyes, I will protect you. The message was clear. Freedom was not just about leaving Egypt. It was about learning to trust God in the wilderness. The desert was not their punishment. It was their training, a place where they would learn who God is, who they are, and how a nation learns to walk by faith. Soon after Mara, the people arrived at a beautiful place called Elim. There were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. After the harsh desert journey, it felt like paradise. The people rested there beside the water. But the journey was not over. Far ahead of them stood a mountain that would change everything. A mountain where God himself would speak to the nation. A mountain called Sinai. And what would happen there would shape history forever. Fire Desert. The story of the sea did not end at the shoreline. For many people, the moment when the waters of the book of Exodus closed over Pharaoh's army feels like the final victory. The enemy was gone. The chains of Egypt were broken. Freedom had arrived. But in truth, the miracle of the sea was only the beginning. Because escaping slavery was easier than learning to live in freedom. The people of Israel had walked through a path no human could create. Through the leadership of Moses, God had opened the sea itself. The impossible became reality in a single night. Yet as the days passed in the desert, something surprising happened. Fear returned. Doubt returned. Complaining returned. The same people who had watched the waters split began to ask questions again. Will God really take care of us? Will we survive this journey? Did we make a mistake leaving Egypt? And that is the deeper message hidden inside the story. Faith is not built in one miracle. Faith is built over a journey. God did not only want to rescue Israel from Pharaoh. He wanted to transform them into a people who could trust him, even when the path ahead looked impossible. The desert became their classroom. Every day was another lesson. When water was bitter, God made it sweet. When food ran out, God would provide. When fear rose again, God would remind them, you are not alone. And eventually, that journey would lead them to one of the most important places in the entire Bible, a mountain where heaven would meet earth. There, the nation would hear God's voice. There, they would receive a covenant that would shape generations. But none of that would have happened without the moment when the sea stood still. The miracle of the Red Sea was more than an escape. It was the moment a group of former slaves became a people walking with God. And the truth is, the story still speaks today. Because everyone faces their own Red Sea at some point in life. Moments when the path forward seems blocked. Moments when fear is chasing from behind. Moments when there seems to be no way out. But the message of crossing of the Red Sea is simple and powerful. Sometimes the greatest miracles happen when there is no way left, except trusting God. And when that moment comes, the sea might open again. Water wave sparkles.